My name is David Carter. I'm 32 years old and I work as a private investigator. I've always been a confirmed skeptic. Spirits, ghosts, mysterious disappearances. For me, everything had a logical explanation. It was just a matter of time and patience until I found the truth behind the legends. But nothing prepared me for that night on the Pine Ridge Highway in Colorado, a highway where the impossible not only seemed real, but was lurking, waiting for me. It was 11:50 p.m. when I pulled my old Ford Taurus to the side of the road. The engine hummed softly, but the rest of the world was plunged into an oppressive silence. I stared at the stretch of asphalt that stretched out in front of me, disappearing into impenetrable darkness. The trees on either side seemed to bend over the road, forming a dark tunnel. The wind blew softly, carrying the damp scent of pine and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify. "Let's get this over with," I muttered, adjusting the dash camera on the car's dashboard. If anything strange happened, I would capture it on video. I gripped the steering wheel and took a deep breath. Local legends spoke of drivers who disappeared after driving through here at midnight. Some returned days later, disoriented, with no memory of what had happened. Others were never seen again. The stories varied, but they had one thing in common. The clock always showed 11:55 p.m. when the problems began. I turned the key and the engine roared louder. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the cracked asphalt and dry leaves scattered on the ground. I began driving slowly, paying attention to every detail. The light from the headlights flickered as it met the shadows of the trees, creating distorted shapes that danced along the way. The silence was thick, as if the night itself was watching me. My eyes searched for anything out of the ordinary, but everything seemed normal. It was just an old, deserted road shrouded in a forest. Nothing more. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. When the clock on the dashboard read 11:55 p.m., I felt a chill run down my spine. The air inside the car seemed colder, and the silence outside grew even deeper. My headlights caught an old wooden sign by the side of the road, its letters almost faded by time. Pine Ridge, 5 miles. I kept driving. A few minutes later, I passed an old, abandoned gas station. The windows were broken, and the rusty gas pump stood like a forgotten sentinel in time. I made a mental note of the landmark and drove on. But then something strange happened. After driving for a few more minutes, I saw the same gas station again. The same broken windows. The same rusty pump. My heart skipped a beat. "It can't be," I whispered. I glanced at the clock. It still read 11:55 p.m. I squinted, trying to figure out what was happening. Maybe I was tired, distracted. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I pressed the accelerator harder. The road continued to stretch out in front of me, an endless black strip. The trees all looked the same, motionless shadows watching me in silence. Then I saw something in the rearview mirror. A blurry shadow was moving behind the car. I couldn't see any details, just a dark shape that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. My heart raced. I turned my head to look back, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the headlights casting light into the darkness. "Calm down, David, it's just your imagination," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Cold sweat was running down my forehead. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I looked at the clock again. 11:55 p.m. Why isn't time passing? My voice was shaky. Suddenly the headlights flickered. For a second everything went dark. When the light came back on, the shadow was closer, visible in the rearview mirror. A tall, distorted, faceless figure. Just a silhouette made of pure emptiness. A chill ran through my entire body. Panic took over me. I stepped on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the car hurtled down the road. The shadow disappeared for a moment, but the feeling that something was following me remained. The landmarks around me repeated themselves. The same gas station, the same fallen tree. It was as if the road was doubling back on itself, trapping me in an endless loop. "This is not possible," I screamed, feeling despair growing. The faint, distant laughter of something that shouldn't exist echoed in my mind. A voice whispered in the wind, "You shouldn't be here." I could no longer deny it. I was trapped in some kind of loop, a perfect trap, woven into the fabric of reality. The clock read 11:55 p.m. The same landmarks kept coming up over and over again. The abandoned gas station, the fallen tree with the lightning strike, and that shadow was getting closer with every passing moment. I floored the accelerator. The engine of my old Ford Taurus roared, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. My eyes were wide, sweat dripping down my face. The chill of fear spread through my body like ice running through my veins. "This isn't real. It can't be real," I screamed to myself, trying to hold on to my sanity. But no matter how fast I drove, it felt like the road was taking me back to the same starting point. It was as if time itself was folding in on itself, trapping me in an endless loop. In the rearview mirror, the shadow was still there. A distorted figure, an absence of light that seemed to devour everything around it. Every time I looked, it got closer. I could feel a cold presence, an invisible pressure that squeezed my chest and stole my breath. Suddenly, the car began to lose power. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The headlights went out, leaving me in total darkness. The silence was absolute, as if the entire world had held its breath. Not now. I hit the steering wheel, but the car gave no sign of life. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and turned it on. The flickering light cut through the darkness for a few meters ahead. Outside, the forest seemed denser. The shadows between the trees seemed to move. Everything in me screamed to stay inside the car, but a stronger part, the survival instinct, forced me to get out. I slowly opened the door. The air was cold and smelled strange, a mixture of wet earth and rusty metal. My feet stepped onto the cold, cracked asphalt. The light from the flashlight trembled along with my hand. "I need to get out of here," I whispered. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the road and the familiar details that I had seen countless times that night. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heart beating. Then there was the sound, a heavy footstep right behind me, then another, like the hooves of an animal hitting the asphalt. I turned around in a sudden movement, the flashlight almost falling from my hand. The light illuminated only the emptiness of the road. There was no one there. But the sound of the footsteps continued, getting closer, louder and louder. "Who's there?" I shouted, desperation overflowing my voice. The silence returned for an endless second. Then a weak, distorted voice whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. I turned the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing, only darkness staring back at me. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, distorted, like a silhouette made of pure emptiness. It had no face, just a black hole where its eyes should be. It moved toward me, slow and inexorable. With each step, the darkness seemed to fold around it, as if it were an extension of its very essence. My lungs burned, the air refusing to enter. I knew that if that thing caught up with me, I would disappear like so many others before me. Finally, my legs obeyed. I turned and ran. I ran with everything I had, my muscles screaming in protest, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of its footsteps followed me, steady and constant, always just a few feet away. The road stretched out before me, but now something was different. A dim light shone in the distance, the headlights of my car, which had somehow come back on. With one last effort, I dove into the car and slammed the door. I turned the key in the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life. I stepped on the gas, the tires screeching on the asphalt. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood on the road motionless, its outline already dissolving into the darkness. But the eyes, or the void where the eyes should have been, were watching me. A silent promise that this was not over. The road finally changed. I saw the Pine Ridge exit sign approaching and speeding past me. The clock on the dashboard ticked to 12:01 a.m. I was free. But as I drove away, a sinister doubt crept into my mind. How many times had I believed I had escaped before? And how many more times would I return to this road? Some legends are not just stories, they are traps, and some prey never quite escape. My name is Lucas Bennett. I'm 25 years old and I'm an urban explorer. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places and their stories. I think it's the mystery, the unknown, or maybe it's just the adrenaline rush of being in places no one else dares to go. It's as if these places are waiting for someone to discover their buried secrets. And this time, my destination was the old gold mine in Cripple Creek, Colorado. The mine had been closed since the late 1800s, after a collapse that claimed the lives of dozens of miners. According to local legend, their spirits never left. Some people said that a shadow protected the remaining gold, keeping away anyone who tried to enter. I didn't believe these stories. To me, it was just an old mine, full of dust and superstition. It was almost sunset when I reached the entrance to the mine. The orange sky contrasted with the darkness that seemed to emanate from the tunnel. The entrance was an archway of old rotting wood and a rusty sign hung from a broken chain. No trespassing. I ignored the sign. I adjusted my backpack on my back, turned on my flashlight, and took a deep breath. "Let's see what you have to hide, mine," I muttered to myself, trying to hide the growing uneasiness in my chest. I took the first step inside. The air immediately grew colder, damper, thick with the smell of earth and rust. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating old tracks, rusty mining carts, and walls that seemed to sweat moisture. The sound of my footsteps echoed as if the mine itself were alive, breathing with me. I walked slowly, taking pictures of the abandoned equipment and old support beams. Each click of the camera seemed too loud, as if I were disturbing something long dormant. After a few minutes, I came to a fork. A tunnel led off to the left, even darker and narrower. Another one went straight ahead, with the ceiling a little higher. I looked at both, feeling an invisible pressure pulling me towards the tunnel on the left. "Sure, let's go the scariest way, because why not?" I grumbled, trying to laugh, but my voice sounded hollow. I walked down the narrow tunnel, the flashlight only illuminating a few feet ahead. The walls seemed closer now, the ceiling lower. The air was thick, as if something heavy was hanging over me. Each step made the wood creak beneath my feet. That was when I heard it for the first time. A low, distant sound, like a pickaxe hitting stone. I stopped abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. "It must be the echo of my footsteps," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But the sounds continued, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deeper in the mine. A cold sensation crept up my spine. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. I kept walking, increasingly aware of the weight of the darkness around me. My hands were sweating despite the cold. I looked back and saw the darkness swallowing the way back. "Don't think about it, Lucas. You're in control," I said to myself, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. Suddenly I saw a shadow move on the periphery of the flashlight's beam, a quick, fleeting movement, but real. I stopped and swung the flashlight, illuminating the walls. Nothing. Just stone, wood, and darkness. "It must be just a bat," I said, but my voice was shaky. I took a few more steps and heard another sound, shuffling footsteps, closer this time. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Fear began to set in for real. "Okay, you've seen enough," I whispered. It was time to go back. But when I tried to go back, something was different. The tunnels seemed to have changed. The path I had come from now branched off in several directions. A chill took over my body. I was lost. The flashlight's light began to flicker. My lungs tightened. The echo of footsteps continued, louder now, as if someone or something was approaching. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed through the darkness. The only answer was a low, icy laugh, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from all sides at once. "You shouldn't be here." My heart stopped for a second. Panic took hold of me. I spun in every direction, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadows seemed to come alive, dancing just out of reach of the light. And then I saw it. A dark figure, tall and distorted, watching me from the end of the tunnel. The shadow took a step forward, and I knew that if I didn't get out of there, I would never get out again. The figure in front of me was an absence of light, a silhouette of pure darkness silhouetted against the gloom of the tunnel. It seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing along with the mine itself. I could see no face or details, only that tall, distorted form watching me. My heart was hammering so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. My lungs seemed to close, each breath short and shallow. The flashlight trembled in my sweaty hand, the weak beam struggling to keep the darkness at bay. The figure took another step forward. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shake. The air grew colder, almost freezing, and a smell of sulfur and burnt metal invaded my nostrils. A low, drawn-out whisper cut through the silence, like the sound of one stone scraping against another. "You shouldn't be here." My legs finally obeyed the command my mind was desperately screaming. I turned and ran. I ran without thinking, without looking back. The tunnels were a tangled maze, but at that moment it didn't matter. I had to get away from this thing. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the narrow walls. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find the exit, but all I found was more tunnels, more darkness. The shadows seemed to close in around me, as if the mine were moving to trap me. And then I heard it. Heavy footsteps behind me. They weren't echoes of my own footsteps. These were slower, more shuffling, but unmistakable. The shadow was following me. "No, no, no!" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. I kept running, stumbling over loose rocks and rusty rails. My flashlight began to fail, the light flickering wildly. With each flicker, the tunnel ahead of me became a gaping maze of pure darkness. And then I tripped over a fallen beam. My body hit the cold, hard ground, the flashlight slipping from my fingers and rolling a few feet forward, landing with its beam pointing upward. I felt pain explode in my knee, but fear was greater than the pain. I looked up and saw the flashlight flickering, casting distorted shadows on the walls of the mine. And then I saw the figure again, standing just beyond the light. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its invisible eyes boring into me. "Please." My voice was barely a whisper. The shadow began to move closer. Each step I took made the air around me grow thicker, as if the mine itself were closing in. The pressure in my chest increased and I couldn't breathe. Then I saw something reflect in the dim light of the flashlight, a small opening in the wall to my right, nearly hidden by a pile of rocks. It was narrow, but perhaps large enough for me to squeeze through. Gathering the last of my strength, I crawled toward the opening. The pain in my knee was excruciating, but panic made me ignore it. The shadow was almost upon me. The cold was unbearable, as if it were sucking the warmth from my soul. With one last effort, I pushed myself through the opening. The rocks scraped my arms and tore my shirt, but I managed to squeeze through. On the other side, a narrow passageway opened upward, and a faint light, natural light, filtered through a crack in the ceiling of the mine. The shadow stopped at the entrance of the opening. It could not follow me there. The cold eased slightly, and I could breathe again. The figure stood there, motionless, watching. Then, with a final whisper, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving only a feeling of emptiness. Fighting to stay conscious, I dragged myself toward the light. Each movement seemed to take forever, but finally I reached the crack. With an almost supernatural effort, I pulled my body out. The cool morning air hit me like a punch. I rolled away from the entrance and lay on the cold grass, panting, my eyes closed. The rising sun tinted the sky with orange and pink hues. I was alive. When I finally opened my eyes, I looked back. The mine entrance seemed small and insignificant now, a mere crack in the rock. But I knew what was down there. I knew that the shadow was still waiting, guarding the secrets and lost souls of that cursed mine. I struggled to my feet, pain in every fiber of my body. I left my flashlight and gear inside. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave and never come back. As I limped back to my car, one last sentence echoed in my mind, repeated by the cold mountain wind. "You shouldn't be here." And for the first time in my life, I knew the legend was real. My name is Chris Miller. I'm an 18-year-old high school senior, and to be honest, I've always loved horror stories. The scarier, the better. But to me, all these urban legends are just that. Stories. Things made up to scare the easily impressed. So when I heard about the haunted cornfields of Fort Collins, My first instinct was to laugh. It's said that farmer Thomas Grady cursed his land after losing everything in a mysterious fire decades ago. Some claim he still walks the cornfields, waiting to exact revenge on anyone who dares trespass on his property after sunset. It's a good story to tell on Halloween night, but nothing more than that. "Shall we go, guys?" I asked my friends as we parked the car near the fields. The night was cold and the sky was clear, with a full moon casting a silvery glow across the landscape. Mike, my best friend, smiled as he adjusted his flashlight. Ready to prove this legend a hoax? Dylan, the most hesitant of the group, snorted. "I don't know why we're doing this. This doesn't seem like a good idea." I laughed and slapped him on the shoulder. "Relax, Dylan. It's just a cornfield. What could happen?" The entrance to the field was just ahead, marked by an old, weathered wooden fence. The dry leaves of the cornfields rustled in the wind, creating an unsettling sound. The trail ahead of us was a narrow strip that disappeared between the tall, dense rows of corn. "Let's go in," Mike said defiantly. We climbed over the fence and started walking along the trail. Our flashlights illuminated the path ahead, but the shadows of the cornfields closed in around us like living walls. The ground was covered in dry leaves that crunched beneath our feet. "Have you heard of the disappearances here?" Mike asked with a mischievous smile. "They say some people go into these fields at night and never come out again." "That's nonsense," I said, rolling my eyes. "People get lost because these fields are so big, that's all." But as we walked, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest. The wind seemed colder in here, and the sound of the corn leaves rustling against each other was like muffled whispers. After a few minutes, I noticed that the trail seemed narrower. The rows of corn were closer together, as if they were closing in around us. I glanced around and felt a twinge of discomfort. It was as if we were being watched. "Did you feel that?" Dylan whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Like someone was here." "It's just your imagination," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But the truth is, I felt it too. Something was wrong. Suddenly we heard a muffled sound of shuffling footsteps coming from somewhere between the rows of corn to our left. We stopped in our tracks, our hearts pounding. The flashlights shook in our hands. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, turning the flashlight to the left. Nothing. Just dense cornfields and leaves swaying gently in the wind. But the footsteps continued, slow and heavy. Each time the sound stopped, the silence became even more oppressive. "This isn't funny," Dylan whispered. "Let's get out of here." Let's just see what it is," I said, trying to ignore the tight knot in my stomach. We took a few more steps, the flashlights illuminating only the leaf-strewn ground and the tall stalks of corn. Then the smell came. A smell of smoke and burning earth. My heart skipped a beat. "Do you smell that?" I asked, my voice coming out lower than I intended. "Yes," Mike murmured. "It sounds like something is burning." And then I saw it. A quick, almost imperceptible movement in the cornfields ahead. A tall, distorted shadow with the outline of a man, but the details were blurry, unreal. "There's someone there," Dylan whispered, his face pale. I wanted to tell him it was just our imaginations, that there was nothing there, but I couldn't. The wind carried a faint whisper, a hoarse, distant voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down my spine. For the first time, I felt real fear settle in my chest. I looked at my friends. The panic was clear in their eyes. And then, without another word, we ran out. We ran without looking back, our feet crunching through dry leaves as the cornfield swallowed us up on all sides. The sound of our heavy breathing mixed with the frantic rustling of the plants. Each step seemed to take us deeper into the suffocating maze. The smell of smoke and scorched earth grew stronger by the second. "This way!" Mike shouted, pointing his flashlight to the right. Without thinking, we followed the flickering light. My legs burned, but fear drove me on. Shadows danced around us, and the feeling of being followed was so strong it felt tangible. I could feel invisible eyes watching us, judging our every move. Suddenly, the sound of shuffling footsteps returned. This time they were closer, as if someone or something was right behind us. "Don't stop!" I shouted, panic filling my voice. Dylan tripped over an exposed root and fell to his knees. His flashlight rolled away, briefly illuminating a shadowy figure that disappeared into the cornfields. "Dylan, get up!" I pulled him by the arm with all my strength. He's here," Dylan stammered, his eyes wide and filled with tears. Mike stared at us, his teeth clenched, his face pale with fear. "We need to get out of here now." We started running again. The field seemed endless. Every trail we took seemed to close behind us. It was as if the corn itself was trapping us, leading us to an inevitable fate. "This doesn't make sense," I shouted, my voice mixing with the sound of the wind. "The trail should be here." Mike stopped suddenly, shining his flashlight on an ancient scarecrow in front of us. Its clothing was burned, the scraps of dark fabric hanging from its straw body. Its face was a charred mask of agony, its eyes made of black buttons, empty and lifeless. "This wasn't here before," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. Before we could react, the scarecrow leaned forward as if watching us. A gust of wind brought a hoarse, deep voice. "You shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. The black buds seemed to glow red, like embers about to go out. "Run!" I screamed, pulling my friends away from the nightmare. We moved in sheer desperation, Dylan's screams echoing in my ears. The smell of smoke became unbearable. The leaves of the cornfields began to burn, small flames spreading quickly. The trail ahead of us was closing in on a sea of fire and ash. "We're going to die here," Dylan whimpered, his tears tracing grooves on his dirty face. "We're not," I screamed, trying desperately to hold on to hope. "There has to be a way out." We turned a corner and came face to face with an old wooden fence. It was tall, but there was a broken section that could be our salvation. Without hesitation, I pushed Dylan forward. "Jump. Go, go." Dylan stepped through the fence, followed by Mike. I was about to cross when I felt a cold, rough hand grab my wrist. I turned and saw a tall, distorted figure. His skin looked like ash, his eyes glowing like red embers. A guttural voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A cold pain shot through my arm. My eyes filled with tears, but adrenaline took over. With a scream of sheer determination, I managed to pull my arm free and crash through the fence, landing heavily on the other side. Mike and Dylan pulled me away, and we ran across the open field until our legs gave out. When we finally stopped, the fire was gone. The field was dark and silent again, as if nothing had happened. The scarecrow, the shadowy figure, the smoke, everything was gone. I fell to my knees, panting, staring at the cornfield in front of us. It was untouched, with no signs of fire or any sinister presence. Everything looked so normal that it was impossible to believe what we had just experienced. Was that real?" Mike whispered, his voice cracking. Dylan hugged his knees, shaking. I'm never going back there." I looked at my wrist. A red handprint was etched into my skin. It was cold to the touch, as if death itself had touched me. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." As we walked away, a gust of wind blew across the field, carrying the faint sound of a low, vengeful laugh. The smell of smoke returned for a moment, then disappeared. I knew we would never forget that night. Some legends aren't just stories, they're warnings. And no matter how hard we tried to run, the curse of the Fort Collins cornfields would live with us forever.